Well, good evening from Copenhagen, and welcome to you all to the webinar Unfolding the Reporting Requirements for Developing Countries under the Paris Agreement's Enhanced Transparency Framework. This webinar is hosted by us here at the UNEP DTU Partnership, and is based actually on a publication with the same name that is actually just published this evening on our website. So you're getting like a sneak peek world preview to the publication. Well, the publication has been realized thanks to the support of the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, or ICAT for short, and the Capacity Building Initiative for Transparency, the CBIT Global Coordination Platform, which are both providing support to developing countries with improved transparency and capacity building under the Paris Agreement. Well, my name is Federico. I work for the UNEP DTU Partnership, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. And just like to mention a couple of things before we move on to the main content. So this webinar is going to be about 1 hour long, including time for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. And in case you cannot stay until the end, or if you want to get back to our presentations at a later stage, all the materials and recording of the whole webinar will be available online in a few days on our website. There we also have a collection of previous webinars on different climate change related topics that you can browse through and select some relevant topics if you're interested. And before we start introducing the speakers, I would like to inform you attendees that we also comply with the General Data Protection Act, or GDPR, which means that your personal data, like the name and the email, workplace, etc., is safely processed and stored. And of course, all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You also have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request the data to be deleted or rectified. And if you want more information or for the access to data, you're welcome to contact us at the UNEP DTU Partnership. So over to the speakers of today. We have the pleasure to have Dr. Henning Wuester, the ICAT Director, to introduce us into today's topic and provide an overview of transparency support ICAT is currently providing to countries. We have Mirko Dalmaso, a Program Associate here at the UNEP DTU Partnership, and finally yours truly, Federico Antonio Canu, Project Officer here at the UNEP DTU Partnership. And Mirko and I are also the main authors behind the publication the webinar is based upon. And finally, also, I would like to inform you that you can send us your questions during the whole presentation, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. And please also do not forget to mention the name of the speaker that the question is for when you ask the question. And please remember to sign up for the next webinar on Thursday, where we will go into more of the details of what the modalities, procedures, and guidance of the Enhanced Transparency Framework, what they provide. Well, now I have the pleasure to give the word to Dr. Henning Wuester that will introduce us to today's main topic, transparency and ICAT. Henning, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Henning Wuester, Director of ICAT, and very pleased to introduce this webinar. Let me highlight one message that I really want to get across, that while you will realize that the Enhanced Transparency Framework under the Paris Agreement might be quite onerous and a lot of work, I want to emphasize that there is also a lot of opportunity from utilizing transparency effectively, and that's certainly something that we from ICAT want to support. So I'll give you a short overview of what ICAT is and what we do, and then hand back to my colleagues in Copenhagen for the more detailed overview on the Enhanced Transparency Framework. ICAT is a multi-stakeholder partnership. We have 4 funders that are supporting the work. Those are the Ministries of Environment from Germany and Italy, and 2 foundations, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation and the Climate Works Foundations. ICAT is managed and the Secretariat is hosted by UNOPS, the project support arm of the United Nations. And we have a number of implementing partners, and I'll not mention them all. You see the organizations here on the screen. Of course, the UNEP DTU partnership is one of them, and they are hosting us here for the webinar today. ICAT works in over 30 countries across the globe. As you can see here on the map, we have some very big G20 countries like China and Brazil, and smaller countries, islands like the Dominican Republic and Sri Lanka, and then countries with size in between those two extremes. What ICAT wants to do is to provide support to policymakers, to provide them with tools so that they can utilize the enhanced transparency to make their climate policies and actions more or most effective. So we support the implementation of the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement, but our focus is really this interface between transparency and policy effectiveness. And I'll mention a few more aspects of that. The work in the 30 countries that we do is really very different country by country. That's because our work is country driven. We define our work plan for each country based on country context and priorities. And there's really no two countries where we do exactly the same. It's all very much country specific. To give you an overview of what we support, of course, basic establishment and development of transparency systems, starting from the institutional side through data systems, IT-based solutions, and data quality management. Very much linked to the Paris Agreement is our support to track progress in implementing NDCs. We help countries to set up NDC tracking frameworks, to choose indicators, to develop indicators, and then to have a system for that in place. We support as a central feature the assessment of impacts of policies, and here not only impacts on GHG emissions, but also impacts on socioeconomic and sustainable development parameters, which can be very critical for the implementation of climate policies in a country. So the focus on supporting countries to highlight and to find domestic benefits of enhanced transparency is very critical, and that also includes then support to using transparency to mobilize finance. And one aspect that I also want to highlight is the potential of transparency to integrate across sectors, of course, from energy, transport, agriculture, and so on, but also integrate horizontally between the local and the national level, and to integrate the work of non-state actors, such as the private sector. ICAT has developed a series of assessment guides which facilitate the assessment of impacts of climate policies. So there are here 5 assessment guides related to different sectors: energy, transport, agriculture, and forestry, focused on assessing the GHG impacts of policies. We have then 3 cross-sectoral guides that cover broader topics like the assessment of the sustainable development impacts of policies, the assessment of the transformational change potential of policies, and that what then the link to subnational and non-state action, and the potential to integrate these actions into a national transparency system. And in addition to that, we have some process guides that help to guide the transparency processes based on state-of-the-art knowledge. So with that, I'll end here my brief overview. Happy to respond to any questions at the end of this webinar, or of course by email. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Henning, for the presentation and introduction to ICAT. I also urge the participants interested in learning more on how to assess the impact of their climate policies to go to the ICAT website and look at the guidance that are there available. And also, you will, through the presentation, see how the ICAT support actually is quite aligned with a lot of the requirements of the Enhanced Transparency Framework and the reporting requirements that come with that. Moving on to the presentation and introduction to the Enhanced Transparency Framework, that from now on I will call ETF for short, to make it easier for us presenters. I'd like to start with the presentation of Mirko and I. And today's presentation basically covers the following content: an introduction to transparency from the Convention and the Paris Agreement, then some information about why we need transparency at the international level, why transparency is useful at the national level, and then we will provide an overview of the modalities, procedures, and guidance for the ETF and the links with the Paris Agreement, and we will round off by describing the reporting instruments and the timeline for the ETF. And as mentioned, there will be time for questions and answers by the end of the session. So, the Enhanced Transparency Framework of the Paris Agreement basically brings forward new challenges in reporting for developing countries, given by the different nature of the previous commitments under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. I mean, transparency or MRV discussions and decisions matured over a long time before Paris as well. I mean, the national communications were already born in 1992. But to improve the transparency and increasing need for global data and information to inform decisions, then COP17 in 2012 decided that developing countries should also start submitting the annual update reports, the BURs, by the end of 2014 to provide an update of the most recently submitted national communication, and also to provide additional information in relation to mitigation actions taken in the country, or mitigation action that we're looking to undertake, and also provide information on their effects as well as support needed and received. It was already back then, of course, understood that developing countries would need support in order to enable biannual reporting on their side. But even though support was and is continued to be provided, we can see that the efforts have not been sufficient to enable biannual reporting for most developing countries within the established timelines. And I mean, before the Paris Agreement, developing countries didn't have a specific mitigation obligation. And MRV had a kind of a retrospective focus on tracking and reporting actual emissions and implemented mitigation actions. So with the Paris Agreement, we now have a clear global goal or global targets, and that is the not increasing the global warming by more than 2 degrees, and to do our best to keep it below 1.5 degrees. And as you know, the framework to achieve these objectives are the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, where all the countries have communicated what they can do in terms of mitigation to achieve the overall objective. And to do that, we need to kind of take a prospective view. We need to look into the future. So in addition to have a clear idea of our current status now. So in other words, we need to communicate how much we're emitting, what we can do in terms of mitigation or commitments, and we also need to continuously track if we are fulfilling our commitments. So with the Paris Agreement and the NDCs, developing countries also have to report on future emissions and mitigation measures to meet their commitments in the future. Following up on the BURs, the expected frequency of reporting is also now biennial for all countries, with the exception of least developed countries and small island development states. And that is because we're taking into account their respective capacities, and so they may report at their discretion under the Paris Agreement. So this figure is quite complex. You might have seen it before. It's from the emission gap reports that are issued every year. But basically it illustrates projections of global GHG emissions under different scenarios and the resulting emission gap in 2030. What it basically shows is that we're currently not on track to meet the global goal set by the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees, or not at least the 1.5 degrees. So we know that the commitments that we have now are not sufficient to achieve the overall objective, but the agreement also has a framework to increase ambition over time, where transparency actually will play a central role to inform the global stocktake and drive future assessments for the needed enhanced ambition. If you see the black line at the top, that illustrates the scenario if no climate policies are implemented. And if you follow the scenarios downwards, we see where we are headed under current policy scenarios. And then we have the scenarios where we have the current NDC commitments with the differentiation between unconditional and conditional NDC scenarios. Then the second last scenario is actually the one in light blue. Is basically where we should be in terms of climate action to limit global warming to 2 degrees. And the last one, the green one, is where we should be in terms of the 1.5 degree targets. And the range of the colors indicates basically the uncertainty of the scenarios. So we actually have a lot of uncertainty of the scenarios as well. But luckily, I mean, this draws a grim picture for the future, but we have this aforementioned framework to increase ambition, where the global stocktake will actually inform future NDC commitments. And also the Paris Agreement establishes that each successive NDC submission has to present a progression beyond the previous NDC and reflect the highest possible ambition. So we expect the ambition, and then following that, these scenarios to move closer to the 2 degree and 1.5 degree target scenarios with time, hopefully. But all in all, to be able to more accurately define our future and the application of our current action, we need to know where we are in terms of emissions. We also need to know where we currently are heading and what we need to do to get to where we want. And that's why transparency is very important. It's basically essential for effective planning. In accordance with Article 13, which is basically the article that describes transparency in the Paris Agreement, the purpose of the framework for transparency of action is to provide a clear understanding of climate change action in the light of the objective of the convention and basically the targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees, including clarity on tracking of progress towards achieving parties' individual NDCs. The two key elements of information, which are important to evaluate the progress and making the necessary course of corrections, are the national GHG inventories, providing an overview of the current status of emissions, and then the projected GHG emissions as communicated through the NDCs. So the framework for transparency will therefore enable the assessment of the adequacy of efforts and guide a discussion for the potential for taking corrective steps to meet the global objective. So that was for mitigation, but the Paris Agreement also basically presents an adaptation goal in its Article 7. It's basically to enhance the adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reduce vulnerability to climate change. And sustainable development has been also part of the convention from the start, so it continues with the Paris Agreement. So the adaptation also with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature increase of 2 or 1.5 degrees. So therefore, the transparency framework also aims to provide clarity on parties' adaptation actions under Article 7. So all this information on tracking mitigation and adaptation, including good practices, priorities, needs, and gaps, which is also defined in the Enhanced Transparency Framework, MPGs, modalities, procedures, and guidance, it will be used to inform the global stocktake. And what the global stocktake will do is that it will periodically take stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement to assess the collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the agreement itself and the long-term goals that it has defined. So still in accordance with Article 13, the purpose of the framework for transparency of support, it has another aspect as well. So we on one side we have the action, and then we have support. Is to provide clarity on the support provided by developed countries and the support received and needed by the individual countries. And also to the extent possible to provide a full overview of aggregate financial support provided to inform the global stocktake. So now we have talked a little bit about why we need transparency at the international level, and Henning touched upon this topic actually during his presentation, but why do we need transparency at the national level? Why is it so important? So basically, it brings forth a wide range of benefits. So transparency, also called MRV or monitoring of evaluation, is used as an integral part of management, or is basically a management tool for planning and implementation by governments at different levels, and also by corporates and organizations. And having information available on GHG emission levels, which through the greenhouse gas inventories, for instance, and also information related to climate change impacts and adaptations, it allows a country to prioritize mitigation and adaptation efforts aligned with the national development priorities. So by creating climate change vulnerability assessments, it allows to make targeted interventions for adapting to the expected adverse impacts of climate change. It also allows designing nationally appropriate mitigation and adaptation policies and measures, and therefore is a powerful tool to ensure that resources are allocated and ensure the highest impact possible. It also provides an evidence-based approach to identify and document the effectiveness of implementation of the selected actions, mitigation or adaptation. And by providing information on these measures, it also provides the necessary feedback to potentially modify the intervention if needed to ensure that the most say valuable or efficient use of resources is that the resources are allocated more efficiently. It is also essential to allow policymakers to make informed decisions at all stages of a policy or measures design and implementation. And it also provides the necessary data to guide like strategic planning to design and implement programs and projects, and thus provides the arguments to also to strategically channel the public finance that you have available. It's also a tool that can be used for budgeting purpose at the national level. And with sound data on the measures' effectiveness and their impacts, the perceived risk for investing in a given activity is removed, or at least diminished, because it becomes easier to attract private investments as well. And transparency is also used to communicate support needed and received for its implementation of activities to the international community. And it's therefore also a tool to attract finance for new activities and scale up financing to replicate successfully supported and impactful actions. And lastly, transparency also allows decision makers to effectively inform the public with real data and information about the results and the beneficiaries of the given policies or measures. And therefore, it also provides a tool both during and after implementation to gather public support for continued or enhanced action. So summing up, basically the modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the Enhanced Transparency Framework, they should not only be regarded as an additional reporting requirement, but also as an opportunity for developing countries. This is just to go more into details of the Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, because the decisions and the wording actually matters. It kind of sets the stage for what's to come in the modalities, procedures, and guidance. So I'll just go quickly through a selection of the sub-articles of Article 13, which are relevant for how the modalities, procedures, and guidance are designed. I will call them MPGs from now to make it short. So Article 13.1 has a specific mention on action and supports. It's meant to build mutual trust and confidence and to promote effective implementation. And here the purpose of the ETF is defined. So not only do we need to report on climate action, but acknowledging the need for developing countries to receive support, the ETF also establishes a framework for transparency on support provided and received. Article 13.2 introduces the term flexibility, and basically the flexibility in the implementation of the enhanced transparency framework to those developing country parties that need it in the light of their capacity. So basically it provides flexibility for countries that don't have the capacity to report the wide set of information that is requested by the MPGs. 13.3 it recognizes the special circumstances of LDCs and SIDS, and also outlines that the ETF should be facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive, respectful of national sovereignty, and avoid placing undue burden on parties. So it's something continuing from previous decisions under the convention, but basically countries should aim to work with what they have. The ETF is not going to be an intrusive framework. Countries will have to basically, based on their specific capacities, provide the information that is requested. And then 13.13 requests the adoption of common modalities, procedures, and guidelines, MPGs, and they are now available through the Katowice package from COP24, and they describe the details of the operationalization of the ETF. And that is what we will go into more details here in the rest of the presentation, and even more into details in the next webinar.
Yes, thank you very much, Federico. I will actually take it from here. My name is Mirko, and good evening, good morning, or good afternoon to all of you that you are following us. So I'll take it from here and talk a bit more about these MPGs, these modalities, procedure, and guidelines that we agreed in Katowice at COP24. So these are essentially doing what the acronym says, which is to provide more details on the substance, timing, and processes of the entire transparency framework described in the Paris Agreement. So the first new aspect that catches the eye when you look at the MPGs is the fact that there is not anymore a distinction between the Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. Now all countries are in principle guided by the same MPGs, with this flexibility for those developing countries that basically needed in light of their capacities. In this context, flexibility is to be self-determined by each country, and in cases of the application of the flexibility provision, the country concerned will have to explain in which area and why it has applied the flexibility provision. And it has the constraints that don't allow them to comply with the original requirements. Furthermore, the country must report and follow up on the areas of improvement identified, providing information on any progress made in addressing the issues and needs, and including a time frame to show how it plans to meet the full requirements in the future. So flexibility is very important, is a very important new aspect, since it accommodates countries with lower capacity to participate in the ETF, and at the same time it allows them to continuously improve over time in the key areas of the ETF, which would allow us ideally to arrive at a common reporting format globally. If we then look at the structure of the MPGs, we can see that the MPGs are divided into 8 chapters. The first one provides an introduction, including the purpose and principles of the MPGs, some clarifications around the principle of flexibility, improve reporting over time, and the reporting format. Then there is chapter 2, which is about the national inventory report of emissions by sources and sinks of greenhouse gases. And then we have the third chapter, which is another very important chapter about how to report on information necessary to track progress on implementing and achieving NDCs. The fourth one is about climate change impact and adaptation. I'm sorry, this is really like a list, but we are almost at the end of it. And then we have chapter 5 and chapter 6, which are about support. One is about support provided and mobilized, especially relevant for developed countries, while the other one is about the support needed and received. And the last two chapters, finally, they are about the technical expert review and the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. And we are now going to focus more on 4 of these chapters, which are the ones relevant for reporting for developing countries. Yes, so we have some figure here. And we start indeed with this 5 chapters, which we just listed. So the greenhouse gas inventory, the information to track progress on NDCs, the information on climate change impacts and adaptation, and the one on the support. So all this information is basically what is gathered in what is called the biennial transparency report, or BTR, which is the key report of the ETF that acts as a reporting vehicles for all these elements under the first column. As you can see in the figure, some of these blocks of information have a dashed or a solid line, meaning that some information are mandatory to be reported and some are not. So these are, if you look at the text of the MPGs or the text in general of the COP, these are the shall and the should requirements. One specific note that we have here is if you look at the star, the red star right here on information on support provided, is to say that this information is actually a mandatory information to be reported, but only for the developed countries. For countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement, the first BTR should be submitted at the latest by the 31st of December 2024. And as Federico also said, with the exception for the LDCs and SIDs, which may submit the BTR at their discretion. This means that the timing for the submission is basically flexible, but these countries still need to follow reporting requirements outlined in the MPGs when they want to submit the BTR. Other key reports that you also see in the figure are the National Inventory Report of Greenhouse Gases and the Adaptation Communications. So the NIR is a mandatory deliverable under the ETF and a component of the BTR, although it can be submitted both as a standalone document, hence the dashed frame, or together with the BTR. The adaptation communication, on the other hand, is not a mandatory submission under the ETF and may be submitted with the BTR or through other reporting vehicles, for example, the NDCs or national communications or national adaptation plans. Finally, in the right part of the figure, we have now what is the review process. In fact, the BTR and the NIR, if it's not included in the BTR, they are the key inputs for these two elements under the column review, which consist of the technical expert review and the multilateral considerations of progress. And the MPGs also provide information on these two processes, and as you can see from the Roman numbers. So the Roman numbers, they stand for the chapters of the MPG that provide the information on these requirements. And essentially, the technical expert review and the multilateral considerations, they take into consideration the NIR, so the greenhouse gases inventory, the information to track progress on NDCs, and the information on financial support, technology, development transfer, and capacity building support provided and mobilized to the developing countries. Then, if we take this figure, which is what we have just seen as a starting point, and we take a step back, we can look at how the ETF and this information provided in the BTR link to the broader picture of the Paris Agreement. So we have already seen the central element of the figure. It's basically saying what are the information to be reported, where they go, and then how the review process works. Then we have basically on the left here the information that should be included in the new NDCs as per Article 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And these are the information that are linked to the ones in the first column of the red area, basically. One extra note maybe on one of these articles, which is Article 8 on loss and damage. These is not specifically mentioned in the MPGs as an Article 8, but the MPGs do mention the possibility to report information related to minimizing and addressing loss and damage. So it is part of what has been agreed in Katowice. So this information fits into the different reports of the ETF, as we have already explained, with the BTR and NIR, which are then inputs for the review column. And then after the review column, what we have is that we have this blue area on the right, which represents the global stocktake and the compliance provisions, which consist, as the name says, of the global stocktake and implementation and compliance mechanism. So the BTR informs the global stocktake on the parties' progress towards achieving NDCs, the parties' adaptation actions, priorities, needs, and gaps, and the support provided and received. And in this way, it aims to, basically, the global stocktake aims to assess the collective progress towards achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And the BTR also informs a compliance mechanism, which what it does is that it facilitates the implementation and promotes the compliance with the provisions of the Paris Agreement. And this implementation and compliance committee can initiate the consideration of issues in case, for example, a party does not submit the BTR or does not participate in the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. And it may also engage in a facilitative consideration of issues in case of significant and persistent inconsistencies of the information submitted. So finally, you can see these two lines that sort of do a loop back to the left of the figure. And that's because the outcomes of the global stocktake and compliance processes, they should become useful information for countries preparing new NDCs, and in a way that would theoretically lead to continuous improvement over time. So new figure. Now we look at the timeline of the ETF, try to put this into a perspective. So if we start with the current reporting requirements, we have under the convention, one of the key reports is the national communication. We have already mentioned them quite a lot during the presentation, and which also includes greenhouse gas inventory, indicated here with the NI, national inventory. They started in 1997 for non-Annex 1 parties, and we also have next to this the BUR, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the biannual update reports, and which came into the current reporting framework in 2011, 2012. And the first BUR from non-Annex 1 parties, as Federico also mentioned, they were submitted by December. They were to be submitted by December 2014. And with the introduction of the ETF, which is established by the Paris Agreement, the key report becomes the BTR, and we have talked a bit about that, which includes also the national inventory report, which is to be submitted every 2 years, starting from no later than the 31st December 2024. And in the period up to 2024, which is referred here as the preparatory phase, developing countries are required to submit the national communications as well as the BUR as part of the requirement under the convention. Then all countries that have ratified the Paris Agreement will continue submitted national communication, as you see in the figure now, basically every 4 years, as it was before, while the requirements for the submission of the BUR will be discontinued. Instead, after this date, all countries which have ratified the Paris Agreement will be required to submit the BTR, including an NIR. And countries can also submit adaptation communication, as you see, together with the BTR, with the national communication or other reporting vehicles. Then basically what happens is that the BTR will undergo a technical expert review, which is what you see here in this pink color, which will be followed, which basically takes like a year and will be followed by the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress that we have already seen. And then the down part of the figure also shows that next to the reporting and review process, there is also this process of NDC submissions, which happens every 5 years, and we have the next submission by 2020. And next to this process, we have the global stocktake, which assesses all these. And the reason why in this figure we call the preparatory phase the phase until 2024 is that in this period, countries have the opportunity to start familiarizing themselves with the MPGs in order to be ready for the first submission of the BTR. And moreover, although the MPGs provide and outline the reporting requirements for the BTR, the topics that they cover include, for example, greenhouse inventories, tracking of NDCs, climate change impacts, and so on. They are definitely of relevance for also other submissions under the convention, which includes the NDCs, for example, and the national communication. And if you look at if you remember the previous figure, which was talking about the NDCs and the links between the NDCs and the BTR, there are definitely some links that are very, very obvious. So countries can, this is to say that countries can already take into account the future requirements for the BTR, which are outlined in the MPGs, when they prepare the upcoming reports or other work streams, such as the NDCs, NCs, and so on. And this can only help in enhancing the readiness for the reporting under the Paris Agreement, as well as the quality of the current reporting as well. But we will talk about more about this in the next webinar, I think. So in this context, when it comes about connecting the dots, we already know that, from the decision of COP24 that yes, now it's in, that basically it's possible to submit national communications and BTR when the submission date coincides, and basically this can be submitted as a single report following the MPGs and including some additional chapters on research. We have written them here. I'm just reading basically on research, training and public awareness, education, systemic observation, and so on. So basically whatever is not included in the BTR, and especially in terms of adaptation, if it's not part of the BTR, it needs to be in the common report with the national communication. And another point that we have here is that countries should be also able to submit the last BUR in conjunction with the first BTR. Therefore, following only the new requirements, let's say, which are more specific and they provide more context. So coming to the summary of this first webinar, one of the main aspects of the ETF lies in this new approach, which we talked about, is consistent with the Paris Agreement, and there is less of a distinction between the developed and developing countries. So basically now all countries can follow, in principle, the same reporting MPGs. However, the MPGs provide some flexibility for developing countries on the details of reporting on some aspects, which we will see in the next webinar again. And they also allow LDCs and seeds to submit the BTR at their discretion, meaning that the timing for the submission is flexible, but they still need to follow the MPGs. And when countries make use of the flexibility, the need for its use has to be specifically explained, and countries also have to provide plans and timeframes for how to meet the full requirements. Next point is that we have seen that the central report to be produced is the BTR, the Biennial Transparency Report, which acts as a reporting vehicle for inventory, information to track progress on NDCs, climate change impacts and adaptation, and information on support provided and received, and may also work as a reporting vehicle for adaptation communication. And we see here that some we have seen that some requirements are mandatory while others are not. Next bullet point is that, as you can expect, the MPGs introduce new requirements in terms of data collections. So for the areas where new information will need to be produced, countries should make use of this preparatory phase, as we called it in the presentation, to start gathering such data. And some of these information we have mentioned may be relevant on or connected to current work streams on NDCs and national communication and so on. And countries can take these information, these interconnections, let's call them, into consideration when preparing such reports. The last point, I think, for this slide, yes, it's that countries still need support to be guided in how the MPGs translate into transparency activities, institutional framework, and procedures that could be established. And the Paris Agreement acknowledges that that there are these needs, and also has one paragraph in the Article 13 that we didn't show, but it talks about the did we show that? Could be. But it talks about the provisions on support to developing countries for adhering to the transparency requirements. So basically, support to transparency. And two examples of global initiatives that can offer such support are the capacity building initiative for transparency, which is a Jeff-founded initiative, and it's the largest global support provider for transparency. And ICAT, the initiative for climate action transparency that Henning already talked about, which provides support in terms of making available, for example, methodologies to assess impacts of climate policies, and provide support to selected countries to enhance their transparency capacities. And yeah, this was the last slide from our side. I think we now open the floor for questions, and we will do our best to answer them.
Yes, and just to put what we have presented here into context of the next webinar, we'll go more into detail in the BTR itself and the information requested. Yes. So this was more the general introduction to the enhanced transparency framework, and the next webinar will go into the details of the information that is requested and should be included in the biannual transparency report. So you can see that we've received some questions. There is a question to Henning. Henning, the question is, do you also work with intergovernmental organizations? So I assume this is in addition to the countries specifically.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Of course, we do collaborate with intergovernmental organizations. And some of them were shown on the slides. I mean, I should also emphasize that we collaborate with the CBIT initiative. But we do, when I was speaking about methodologies that ICAT has produced, we did prepare those also with support and collaboration from other intergovernmental organizations, for the International Renewable Energy Agency on the renewable side, or FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, on the agriculture work. So we indeed do collaborate, and if the question was whether we actually support these IGOs, then I should say that we have not done that so far. So our support goes really to countries represented by their climate focal points.
Thank you, Henning. Actually, there is another question I think is directed to you from Lawrence Obi from Ether. And how can non-Annex 1 countries access ICAT support? And what is ICAT's role under CBIT?
So thank you to Ether for that question. I start with the second one. ICAT is independent of CBIT, but as I said, we do collaborate, we exchange information, we harmonize our activities, so we utilize each other's products where relevant and necessary. And sometimes when we work in the same countries, And at the same time, we also prepare harmonized work plans so that ICAT covers certain aspects and CBIT covers other aspects. On the first question, how to access ICAT, basically, in contrast to CBIT, we are fairly simple and informal in the way that developing countries can request support from ICAT. So we need a request that comes from the country, explains what the needs are, and then we can start discussing with the country the feasibility of an ICAT project to support covering the needs that the country has. So the first step is really to approach us. Of course, we don't have unlimited funding, but we do still have additional available funds for additional countries to be supported.
Okay, thank you, Henning. Let's see, there are a lot of questions coming in, actually. I think there are two questions related to national communications and the biannual transparency report. So I'll ask them in one go. So what additional information is expected as part of the national communication beyond what is covered by the biannual transparency report? So one goes about the information additional to the BTR, which the NCs ask about. And the second question related to, which is related to the same topic, is that how would the national communication reporting be in the presented time frame? For instance, in the year of submission, the national communication, if it intersects with the BTR or NDC. So I think one question is about the contents, the year they can be combined, and another one is about the frequency. When can they be submitted together?
Well, yeah, I can take this one. For the frequency, so since national communications is every 4 years and biennial transparency report is every 2 years, you will have some years where they will coincide and some years where they will not. And so this answers sort of the frequency question, I guess. And for the kind of information, we mentioned some of them there, and I can go through it again. So basically, it's about the common report, which includes this blended national communication and biennial transparency report. We'll have to follow the MPGs, so that's the main thing that has to be followed. But it has to include some additional chapters on, one is the research and systemic observation. This is one, education, training, and public awareness, and adaptation if it's not covered in the BTR, essentially. And we have in the publication, we have more information about this and also the link to the relevant decision. I think it's easier probably to follow to the main decision text.
Yeah,
but these are the information that basically needs to be adjusted.
And if I can add to that, the BTR, the biennial transparency reports, is can be submitted in conjunction with the national communication. So the does not relate to the NDC in that sense, in terms of submission. And the additional information that needs to be provided when the national communication and biennial transparency report are provided in one report, I mean, then the BTR rules will prevail. But since this aspect that Mirko mentioned are asked in national communication, information on that should be provided as well. So I hope we covered those questions. I see there is another question from Sophie Louise Seglado. A question more on MRV specifically is, what factors make an MRV of mitigation action sustainable? Are there any success factors? This is a very relevant question. I would say there can be many success factors. What we usually talk about when it comes to sustainability actually covers different aspects and actually differs from country to country. I would say one of the success factors is usually what is there already, what system is there already. And of course, countries are very different and they have different priorities, they have different capacities, and they have different funds available for MRV in general. But basically, if there are institutions that have done this for a while and know how to do it and have established rules and procedures on how to do this, that's one of the success factors. We talk a lot of times about data availability, but what we see is that data usually is there in one way or another. It's about structuring the data, and to structure the data, you need strong institutions which not only collect the information which is out there, but actually systematize it and structures it and makes it available for other institutions to utilize. So strong institutions with capacities to do it, and so that means also that they see the value in doing this. And to do that, I would say that is actually a question of budgets as well. So national budget lines that are provided to have these kind of activities are very important. Some countries which don't, I mean, which are very, which have very limited funds, are very good at trying to attract funds from outside to continue working on these activities. So even though countries are different and have different capacities and different budget availabilities, there are ways to come around it. But to be able to apply and recurrently apply for funds and support to do this kind of activities, you still need strong institutions. So I would say institutions are crucial, and the capacities within the institutions to do this are crucial.
Yeah. If I can just add one small thing to this, I think it's crucial that institutions are strong, but since we talk about also sustainable development, sustainability, it's a cross-cutting issue which looks into so many different factors. So it's also very important that institutions collaborate with each other. I mean, at the level of ministries, it's super relevant when you have to build an MRV system for sustainability and sustainable development impacts, that you have ministries that talk to each other and exchange information, because the Ministry of Health would have some relevant information for this part of sustainable development, while the Ministry of Transport will have something else. So it's also about how you plug everything together. Yeah.
If I may add one piece there, I think you should add also the legal aspect. So having some legal framework for MRV in the country facilitates collaboration, especially among different ministries. So either it can be a regulation, a presidential decree, or a climate change framework law, but that helps greatly.
Yes, thank you, Henning. Also, there is a question for me, but I think you actually would be more appropriate to answer this. I work in 2 ICAT countries, but you might have a broader overview of country needs and challenges. So I can answer based on the 2 countries where I work, and you might answer with overall view. But what are the biggest challenges that ICAT meets when establishing transparency arrangements in the countries you work in? So starting off with the countries I've collaborated with, it actually really depends. Some countries have maybe 2 permanent staff working on climate change issues, and they also are responsible for coordinating the transparency aspects. And that can be a very big challenge, because you might work on 5 different projects simultaneously and work with everything climate change related. And you also need to take care of coordinating transparency issues with the other ministries. So one thing is staffing and resources, which also involves the ICAT work, because this is staff that might be overwhelmed by the amount of work that they have. Luckily, though, that kind of staff tends to have a great overview of everything climate change related. So they're also really great sources of data, information, and contacts with all the relevant people, focal points in the other ministries. Another challenge is the availability of data and information, or I would say the information and the data usually is there when you dig deep and spend time and talk and interact with the institutions, but the lack of a centralized data repository for relevant information, I would say. That's what I've seen. Maybe you can add on that if you have something, Henning.
I would agree with you. It is very country specific, but the general point that there is often a lack of staffing to coordinate the necessary work across sectors and sufficiently broadly. That's really common almost to all countries. often the work relies on one person, and then ICAT is most successful if we manage to fund an expert that can closely work with that one person and support that one person, or even better, an institution that can do that from the outside, which has the trust of the ministry. And then the other point I would highlight is that the ministry in charge, often the environment ministry, might not be the strongest ministry in the mix of ministries, and they don't have the data. They have to ask energy ministry, the transport ministry, and so on to provide the data. And so if they don't have the power to do that, then an MRV system can be quite challenging, and the work that ICAT does would be very limited.
Well, thank you, Henning. Another question that we have is how to benefit from both CBIT and ICAT. Should the national focal point be appointed or government, or could there be through one of ongoing relevant projects like national communications projects? I think, do you want to answer that for ICAT, maybe, Henning?
Yeah, I mean, we would prefer to go separately through a national focal point. Of course, we very much want to link then the work that ICAT does to other ongoing work, and we usually have other activities going on in parallel while ICAT supports a certain transparency-related activity. But it is for us ideal if a focal point that has a coordinating role approaches ICAT.
Yes, thank you, Henning. And for CBIT, it's basically a JEF initiative. So you should have a JEF focal point in your country that you can get in touch with and start considering to put together a JEF proposal for CBIT activities. If there is actually not already going on, because we see sometimes that the JEF focal point doesn't necessarily interact with everyone in the Ministry of Environment, for instance. So for CBIT is the JEF focal point in the country, but in terms of the scope of work, I think it should definitely be coordinated together, if they're not the same, together with the climate change unit or climate change office or climate change ministry, and the people who specifically work on transparency in those institutions. Yes, we have another question here. Where and when can we get the application form for the report procedure? I don't know if I understand the question correctly, but for the report, I assume it is the biannual transparency report. So the report that has to be submitted every 2 years from end 2014. There is not really an application form. I mean, this is a report that needs to be submitted from the countries. And maybe you refer to a specific guidance on how to provide the report. And we're expecting that by the end of 2020, the UNFCCC will provide like basically a table of contents for the biannual transparency report and common reporting tables, so Excel-based tables that countries will have to fill in the specific information requested. We will provide more information about what goes into the biannual transparency report in the next webinar. So if you join us on Thursday, you will get more information on that. If it's about application form in terms of apply for support, then basically I think that Henning answered the question on ICAT and I answered the question on CBIT earlier. I see one more question here. What is the recommendation for establishing good MRV or mitigation actions to live up to the enhancedness of the ETF when a country does not yet have any established MRV systems? Well, I would say usually countries have some form of MRV system or components to an MRV system in place. Most countries, countries have made greenhouse gas inventories. Countries usually within the ministries themselves have a sort of monitoring and evaluation framework, or some people working on transparency related activities within the ministry, not necessarily with the UNEP CCC reports in mind, but they have some sort of activities where they track information about the sectors, the line relevant to the line ministries. So the energy ministry will have information on energy relevant data and activities. The Ministry of Transport the same, the Ministry of Agriculture the same, the Forestry Ministry or department will have the same. So I would say that if you have a climate change relevant mitigation action, the first point of contact, in my view, should be the ministry, if you're working at the national level, to try to source that information. But when it comes to the MRV of the actions themselves, this is actually something we need to consider when designing the actions. How are we going to track its implementation? How are we going to assess the impacts of these actions? And actually here, the ETF provides some sort of guidance of relevant information that you should consider when you have a mitigation action. So you can look for the MPGs that we will present next time to get some information about relevant information to track. But I would say that also each mitigation action, it can be kind of different from each other. So it will depend also what kind of activity you want to implement, the national priorities of other indicators than just mitigation relevant GHG emission reductions you want to track. You might, for some countries, it's very important to track job creation or poverty reduction or the advancements of private sector involvement in services, for instance. So it also depends on what the purpose of the MRV is, and that depends on the institutions and the priorities of the country. So look for what you, if I want to sum up, look for what you already have and what's already there, and then, I mean, you would usually then try to work towards having a climate change related MRV system at the national level, but each sort of mitigation action should have established some procedures that feeds into the national level MRV system. So each action themselves should have established a sort of MRV plan for itself. I see there is one more question. Can we be guided with the appropriate greenhouse gas emission relative to the work, for example, biodiversity, renewable energy applications, and others? If you can be guided by the greenhouse gas emissions when you work on other aspects as biodiversity or renewable energy, etc. And I think, well, we now work in the context of climate change, and greenhouse gas emissions is kind of the currency that we operate with. But there is definitely a connection with other currencies, if you want to put it like this, the SDGs, right? We have now a framework which also, I mean, encompasses a lot of other aspects which are relevant. What in the MPGs is described as non-GHG impacts. We will come back to that. But basically, talking about climate change, we need to consider greenhouse gas emissions, but climate change is also more than that. It's also adaptation, and it's also connected to sustainable development. So biodiversity, renewable energies is also, you can talk about energy access or rural electrification and a lot of other aspects which are very relevant. And the greenhouse gas emission potential might not necessarily be the sole priority to go after. We know for sure that a lot of countries look at merging other priorities as well when thinking about mitigation. Basically, not only where can we get the most mitigation out of our actions, but where can we get most impacts out of our action, not only look at mitigation. So greenhouse gas emissions is important, but it's definitely worth broadening the scope and looking at non-GHG impacts as well. And I think that was the last question I can see here. Well, then I'd like to thank you all for your presence. I'd like to thank Henning and Mirko for the detailed answers to the questions. I would like to thank all the people that actually taken the time and effort to write down the questions and showed more interest. I hope I see you all on Thursday, and that you will join us to get more information about actually what information goes into the reports themselves. So ladies and gentlemen, Again, thank you to the panelists for the informative and interesting presentations, to the audience for the active participation. And we hope that the presentation will be beneficial for you and for your work. And good day and good night from Copenhagen. Thank you.